everyone. My name is Xinyue. I'm a PhD student from the University of Maryland. Today, I'm going to share with you a computational modeling method called Evolutionary Game Theoretic Modeling and introduce its applications to cross-cultural psychology. Here is a quick overview. I will first give a brief introduction of what an EHD model is, and then share several examples on its applications. So what is an evolutionary game theoretic model? A EHD model is the application of game theory to evolving populations. This may sound a bit vague now, but I will first show you what a game is and then how to apply the game to an evolving population. So what is a strategic game? Now let's start with a simple example, a cooperation game. We are all familiar with cooperation. Cooperation means an individual carries out a behavior that is costly to perform but benefits other individuals. Now let's think about this process in a relatively quantitative way. Imagine that there are two individuals, what we call two agents. They all start with an amount of resources. This can be their time or their money. And then to cooperate means that an individual is willing to spend 1 unit of resource for their partner to receive a larger benefit. In this case, is 3 units of resources. And if an individual choose to conduct such a behavior because this person chose to cooperate. And on the other hand, if someone chooses not to cooperate or to defect, that means the individual will not spend anything and their partner will not receive any benefit from such decision. And now let's represent this process in relatively in a more numerical way. Then to cooperate means that one is willing to decrease their payoff by 1 for their partner to receive an increase of payoff by 3 units. And if someone chooses to defect, then the person will spend nothing and the partner will receive nothing as a result. And this is from a single person's perspective. And now let's imagine that if we have a pair of agents, they make such decisions at the same time. There will be all the 4 kinds of different combinations. And if we add a number together and put them in a matrix, this becomes the famous payoff matrix of a cooperation game, aka prisoner's dilemma. And this is how we use such a payoff matrix to represent a social interaction with a cooperation nature. And you can also use such payoff matrix to represent other kinds of interactions. For example, if you want to represent an interaction with a coordination nature, you can use the coordination game payoff matrix. If the 2 person they successfully coordinate, they will both get the payoff, and if they fail to coordinate, none of them will get the payoff. And there are also many other different kinds of payoff matrix. You can use this payoff matrix to represent different kinds of interactions, but what is most important is that you can create your own game. Imagine what kind of scenario you want to represent and try to represent it numerically so that you can create your own payoff matrix and your own game to represent the scenario of interest. And here, so far, we've talked about a pairwise game. And then let's apply it to an evolving population. Now imagine that you have a population of agents, and different agents, they start with different kinds of behaviors. For example, in this example, someone started as a cooperator and someone started as a defector. And in this example, I give them a great social network, but network is not necessary. And if you have a network, then you just like people in this population to interact with their neighbors on the network. If you don't have a network, you can create your own rules of who should cooperate, who should interact with who. And after all of them interact based on such a game, they will get payoffs as shown in this picture. And agents' payoffs reflect their fitness or how adaptive they are to the environment. If you have higher payoff through social interactions, that means your behavior may be beneficial for your survival. So this is what we call evolutionary fitness. And then based on these payoffs, strategy updating happens. And the rule of strategy updating is that agents with higher payoffs are more likely to reproduce their strategies to the population. So this is trying to mimic evolution in biological world, where like individuals, they have higher evolutionary fitness, are more likely to reproduce. But in terms of social science, this reproduction process means social learning. It means that people who have higher payoffs, their strategies or their behaviors are more likely to be learned by others. And in this example, for example, this person who originally is a carpenter, because the payoff is too low, so he or she is more likely to learn from this neighbor with higher payoff. So in this case, this person become a defector now. And now you have a population where the agents have new strategies. And then with this new strategy, they interact again, and then they gain payoffs again, and they update their strategy again. So if you repeat this loop, you will be able to observe the change of different behaviors across time. And this is the EGT framework that we use to study the evolution of behaviors. And then in the next section, I will show you how we can apply this framework to study cultural dynamics. So specifically, I will show you 3 applications of EGT models, but of course there are more. And the 3 examples I'm going to show you is first, how you can apply EGT models to examine the impacts of environmental factors on cultural norms. And second, how you can use EGT models to test the hypothesis and mechanisms behind cultural phenomena. And third, how you can use EGT models to predict trajectories of cultural change. So now let's start with the first example, examining the impacts of environmental factors on culture. So one of the most studied topics in cross-cultural psychology is how ecological factors influence culture. And the traditional way, usually how researchers in cross-cultural psychology did it, is through correlational studies. You observe different societies and measure the ecological factor, and then conduct a correlational study, and then show the relationship between certain factors and cultural outcomes. And the disadvantage of this method is obvious too. It's hard for us to get causal inference from correlational studies, because it's usually hard for you to manipulate a certain part of the society and examine its impacts on the population level. But with an UGT model, it becomes a lot easier, because you created the model yourself, and the agents, their interactions, the environment is totally under your control. So you can conduct virtual experiments by implementing or manipulating certain environmental factors and examine their outcomes on the populational level directly. For example, in this example, in Gelfand and her colleagues in 2011 did a correlational study, and they found that ecological threats is correlated with cultural tightness, which is the strength of social norms. They found that societies with more threats tend to have stronger social norms. And the UGT model can help you test this hypothesis to address more like a causal inference. For example, Rose et al., they conducted a study where they examined how ecological factors influence people's the extent to which people follow social norms, and to what extent they punish norm violators. What they did is that they manipulated the level of threat in the environment, and they found that as threat increases, they did see an increase of cooperation rate in the population, which means more people are following social norms as an increase of threat. And also they showed an increase of punishment, which is like to what extent people are enforcing social norms. And so through such an EGT model, they were able to directly test the impact of threat on social norms. And there are also many other examples. For example, EGT models have been used to study honor culture and third-party punishment and ethnocentrism behaviors. And the second application is to use it to test hypotheses and mechanisms behind phenomena. In other words, you can design the agents in a way that you suppose human beings will do. and let them interact in a way that you want, and then examine whether through certain mechanism that the population can evolve an emerging state as you expected. And if so, that means your hypothesis, the mechanism, or your hypothesis of human behaviors is at least consistent with observed data or predicted phenomena. So an example of this is where researchers use EGD models to study why people follow social norms or why they cooperate. And these are all the mechanisms that they hypothesized. So the way they do it is that they implement different mechanisms in the model and see whether the population ended up cooperating. And if so, that means the mechanism they implemented is one of the explanations for the evolution of cooperation. And the third way how you can use an EGT model is to predict evolutionary trajectories of cultural change, especially when you have some environmental change or intervention and you want to predict how the population will react to that. For example, in early 2020, many researchers were interested in how we can predict whether a society can adopt a cooperative norm, which can help us control the COVID-19 condition. And one of such behaviors is like mask wearing. It's a cooperative behavior because it's costly or it's effortful and uncomfortable for an individual to do that, but it actually protects everyone. And I did an EGT model where I compared the adoption of cooperative norms in tight versus loose cultures. A tight culture is a culture where people have strong pressure to conform with others. And I found that compared with a loose culture, tight culture, people can adopt a cooperative norm in general faster. And this is consistent with empirical findings. And there are also other examples. For example, EGD models has been used to study norm change and their environmental shock, tipping points of norm change. In this example, they compared under what circumstance norm will change gradually versus like slowly but with an abrupt change. And it can also be used to study specific norms such as vaccination behavior and smoking behavior. And there are, of course, other applications of EGD models. For example, they have been widely used to study cultural learning, norm internalization, and more complex intergroup relations. So just a quick summary, EGD models are an application of game theory to involving populations, and it can have many applications to study cross-cultural phenomena. But of course, evolutionary game theoretic models are not without limitation. The biggest problem is that for any model, it's always an oversimplification of what is happening in the real world. We have to make some oversimplified assumptions. Sometimes these assumptions are justifiable, but sometimes these assumptions are only applicable under certain circumstances. So we should always be careful what our assumptions are. And another limitation is an EGD model always tend to focus on behaviors, but they lack the ability to include a complex cognitive or emotional processes. But the good news is that recent research has developed many adaptations to traditional EGD models. So now they're trying to incorporate more cognitive processes. So this is a promising future direction. And EGD models usually rely on a small set of discrete strategies, so they tend to ignore other individual differences. And another problem is the black box problem. So even though we have a model that perfectly predicts real world data, we can never say that this is the true model because there are always other alternative explanations. What we can do is we can only like try to approximate the truth, but any model is always falsifiable. And most importantly, for any model, we always need to validate it with real world data. And if you are looking for more resources regarding EGD models, so everything I presented today can be found in this paper. And in the last section of this paper, I also provided many resources that you can look at, but I specifically recommend this Cultural Evolutionary Society tutorial. So if you click on this link, you will be able to find a lot of good resources on their website. And I also created a step-by-step tutorial myself. If you scan this QR code, you will be able to see my code. And finally, always feel free to email me if you have any questions regarding this presentation or on EGT modeling in general. And thank you for your attention.